Good day, everyone. I think we're there. I think we're live. A warm welcome from my side, and thank you very much for joining this session of the Geneva Trade Week called Trade and Digital Africa, Innovating for Inclusive and Sustainable Continental Integration. My name is Robert, and I work for the German development agency GIZ, and I will be your moderator for the first hour of this session. This session is brought to you by CUTS Geneva, the African Trade Policy Center, and GIZ, and is being organized under the umbrella of a CUTS project on e-commerce and African regional integration. Its main output has been a series of studies on e-commerce, which will inform today's discussion. This session runs until 6:30 and will be divided in 4 parts. First of all, Tammo Strumple will provide us with an opening statement on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, which supported the CUTS project. Second, Yasmin Ismail will present the findings and lessons learned from the studies. A third part will be a panel discussion. And on the 1-hour mark, the fourth and final part, the open discussion will start. This is the point where you as an audience will also come in with your questions and comments. And although your microphones will be muted, we welcome you to write your questions in the chat. Please address them to the general chat or the panel as a whole so we can all see them. Feel free also to use the raise hand tool, which should be available to you. If needed, our technical support will unmute you to facilitate the discussion. If this happens, please introduce yourself and if possible, use a camera also. With that technicality out of the way, let's get on with the program. I would like to invite Tammo to officially open this session. Tammo is a senior policy advisor at the Trade Policy Unit of the BMZ, and in that capacity responsible for the topic of digital trade. Tammo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and sorry for delay. That's digitalization in Germany. It's not so easy, but can everybody hear me now? It's fine, it's working.
I can hear you now.
Thank you. So, dear supporters of Digital Africa, hello again from my side. I would like to welcome you to this session, which marks the completion of, I think, very fruitful joint project between CUTS, International Geneva, and the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And first, I would like to take the opportunity to thank CUTS and GIZ for the important work and for organizing this session. We are very happy that so many of you decided to join us today, even though we can only e-meet, but maybe we have to get used to the fact that in future that events can only take place virtual. Definitely, these past months of COVID-19 crisis have underscored our dependence on digital technologies. They have shown us the value of e-commerce and contactless payments, and they have also shown us the enormous urgency of bridging digital divides to enable all countries to use the potential of digitalization to reduce poverty, to empower women and youth, and to increase employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. Digital technologies give us important opportunities to strengthen trade and sustainable development. So to this end, it is of utmost importance to foster innovative policies at the national, regional, and international level. For Germany, I can say that we are highly committed to enhance the digital dimension in development cooperation. And we appreciate that more and more leaders and policymakers of developing countries have been accelerating their efforts to develop strategies and to establish suitable environments for e-commerce growth. This is particularly evident on the African continent. The importance of the digital dimension to German development cooperation is highlighted by BMZ's digital agenda. E-commerce is a part of that agenda and one of the key topics for our trade policy division at BMZ, what I'm working for. That is why we are very glad to share the key findings of the research today and to exchange knowledge, insights, and views on ways to take Africa forward on the digital path through African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. AfCFTA indeed offers a unique opportunity for building a stronger and more inclusive participation in e-commerce in Africa. Let me highlight this upcoming AfCFTA. From our view, it had the potential to change the face of a whole continent. Boosting intra-African trade would have major economic benefits. Germany, along with other donors like EU, for example, actively support this process and stands committed to also support its implementation. A strong AfCFTA might even be one building block out of the current crisis. So I'm happy to tell you that BMZ is just planning further contribution to AfCFTA out of our Marshall Plan with Africa, which is the cornerstone of our partnership with Africa. That's why I'm very grateful for the studies, especially with their focus on AfCFTA. First one, the role of the African Continental Free Trade Area for Africa in the digital era. And second, what can AfCFTA learn from existing e-commerce provisions and regional trade agreements within and outside Africa? No less important, the third one, the gender dimension of e-commerce, which examine the role of digitalization and e-commerce growth as development enablers for women, that they bring new social, political, and economic opportunities. Utilizing e-commerce as means for women's economic empowerment is very important for the German government. The e-Skills for Girls initiative, established under the umbrella of Germany's G20 presidency, is a good example of using education to enhance both equality and the digital economy. All three studies outline possible future steps for an inclusive and sustainable African integration in the digital era. As BM said, we are confident that all studies have contributed substance to related policy debates on e-commerce, both on the level of the AfCFTA and at the WTO. And we are happy that today's session will contribute its part to discuss these and other ways forward. Today, we emit still again in challenging times, as I mentioned before. It's therefore that we have to look on new innovative approaches. With these three studies, I think we have a very good basis for an interesting discussion. So I have to say that I'm sorry I have to leave the session a little bit earlier, but I wish you a very good and fruitful discussion, and thanks very much for your kind attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I would now like to invite Jasmine to start her presentation. First of all, a bit of background on her while she gets ready and we set up the PowerPoint slide. Jasmine is a research fellow at CUTS International Geneva, and her research interests include the WTO institutional reform, new issues under the WTO including e-commerce, African integration, and China-Africa relations. And she holds 2 master's degrees in economics of development and in international European law from the University of Grenoble in France. Prior to joining CUTS, Jasmine worked as a project manager at Global Partners Governance, a UK-based international consultancy specialized in designing and implementing institutional and governance reform projects. Jasmine, please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Robert. So I hope you can see my screen now. As highlighted earlier, so the basis for my presentation is actually 3 studies that were conducted by CUTS International Geneva and published with funding support from the GIZ. And the studies looked at how e-commerce or digital trade can be leveraged to promote economic growth, intra-African trade, and development through the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And the key purpose of my presentation today is to outline some of the key findings and lessons learned from those studies, but also taking one more factor into consideration, a factor that has invited us all to rethink every aspect of our daily normal life, and that's COVID-19 health crisis and implications. So the outline of my presentation I'll start with sharing some key insights on what COVID-19 revealed about the digital economy rise in Africa and the challenges ahead. Then we will explore, in light of this overview, how AfCFTA e-commerce protocol can be leveraged to respond to the challenges and ensure that e-commerce digital economy will leave no one behind. What lessons can we learn from other RTAs e-commerce provisions? And finally, we will identify key e-commerce related policies subject to discussion and negotiation at the multilateral level, and what kind of potential they may have on AfCFTA e-commerce protocol discussions. So, sorry, it's a bit, yeah. So with regard to COVID-19, I found this phrase that it was a sort of like a digital economy stress test, and I really liked it. It was a digital economy stress test, and it was a stress test for the whole world and not only Africa. But we can see that business to consumer and business to business online purchasing surged as digital means suddenly became the sole mean of communication and the primary mean to shop for basic day-to-day essentials. What did this mean for Africa? So we can see that significant consumer behavioral changes, with more people adhering to online shops and accepting to let go of their preference for cash transactions. And that is huge for Africa. That's a huge change for Africa, for consumers to start accepting and let go of their mistrust for online cashless transactions. However, they need to be supported in order for it to generate and to be kept in the future. So I examined some of the Jumia, one of the lead platform, African platform now in Africa's quarterly reports, and find some interesting statements. Like in the one of the reports, they said the last 15 days of March witnessed 4 times increase of items sold compared to last year. So we're talking about only 2 weeks in March with the confinements. Also, they said that in their second quarter for 2020 is that penetration of payment on platform using Jumia Pay more than doubled compared to quarter 2 in 2019. So that can give some impression of how this can be beneficial for platform business to grow in Africa. While this can be positive for platform-based retail businesses, reliance on supply through global value chains, and the problem is that reliance on supply through global value chains and the weak postal systems and infrastructure across Africa stood against stock availability and ability to respond to the surge of demand by the consumers. So in other words, companies like Jumia were unable to 100% reap the fruits of what happened with this surge in demand because of those 2 main challenges. COVID-19 eventually magnified how African societies and economies still lag behind the rest of the world in digitization, and revealed one more constraint, and that's time, that the luxury of time now seems to have disappeared completely. We need to act now, and we need to act fast. We don't have the time that we had yesterday. So now, how can AfCFTA e-commerce protocol represent itself as an opportunity to address those key challenges? The idea is that COVID-19 gave 2 key messages: the need to accelerate bridging the digital divide by promoting the creation of a digital ecosystem and societies. It also proved that the need for Africa to reduce reliance on global value chains by facilitating intra-African e-commerce trade and facilitating the emergence of regional value chains and promoting manufacturing. In other words, Africa needs to be self-reliant Now there are steps that are being taken in terms of the pharmaceutical sector, for example, and on how to have to be self-reliant in manufacturing using regional value chains in the sector. And some studies by McKinsey and other organizations are showing that this can add to the GDP of African countries and can also prove useful in a context where global trade is slowing down. To enable this, AfCFTA need to contribute to scale up and accelerate what is called the new e-commerce cross-border chain. We need to enable online businesses by providing the infrastructure needed, connectivity, and all the key needs. E-services, governments, and electronic payments and financial systems need to be active. Then we can have, with online businesses, e-government, e-transactions, we can have transaction happening across the border. Then we need to have postal capacities and other requirements that facilitate the delivery of products and deal with after-sales issue and other trust issues that are mainly related to weak regulatory frameworks. Only then we can have e-commerce contributing to increasing intra-African trade, but also when intra-African trade is increased through e-commerce, it can catalyze more and more digital societies, and we can have Africa shaping its position in the Industry 4.0 in the future and have regional value chains created. Now, all those needs across the chain are reflected in a way or another in regional trade agreements that have been already exist other than the AfCFTA. And the provisions have focused on these in different ways according to the country needs, and we will see this later on. Now, another factor that COVID-19 has explicitly shown is that e-commerce, digital economy, digitalization can be a double-edged sword. In other words, e-commerce proved itself as a mean that contributed to people being able to have access to their day-to-day needs and necessities. So ensuring that e-commerce growth will leave no one behind became very crucial. We saw also the role that online shopping played in getting access to medical supplies that are related to protecting ourselves during the COVID. We saw the role that digital platforms played in ensuring traditional services are being delivered, like education. And so all of this makes us wonder, so what about poor rural areas? And what about African women, for example, who, according to the European Investment Bank, only 27% of them have internet access in 2020, and only 15% of them can afford to use it. Which means that if we wake up tomorrow on another confinement, which can happen in a day or night, or less than few hours, this means that girls may not have, and women may not have access to the education they need. Their children may not have access to the education they need, which means that e-commerce as well, digitalization, or adopting e-commerce and adopting digital economy too early can lead to more discrimination with non-intention, in other words. So this means that the level of ambition of gender mainstreaming should be increased in AfCFTA by ensuring that a bottom-up approach is applied. So the main problem with gender mainstreaming has proved to be is that the considerable lack of information, knowledge, statistics of what's happening on the ground. So this key area stood against having well-established gender provisions, for example, in other RTAs, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. We can see that in existing RTAs, when it comes to e-commerce, for example, we rarely can find provisions with well-established gender dimension and social inclusion dimension. So this is one key area of lack in knowledge that needs to be addressed and promoted. Also, promoting a top-down approach, because this proved very useful in the case of Africa in general, to build on the strategies and policies that are being promoted at the regional economic communities and also at the national level. So have a bottom-up approach from national to continental and the way down. Now another aspect is, Now, what other lessons can we learn from e-commerce provisions in RTAs? We can see that especially RTAs where provisions on e-commerce existed, and where small developing countries were partner in those RTAs. We can see that cooperation provisions were dominant, for sure. But also we can see consumer protection was also very dominant, customs duties, and those were like cooperation was very significant, especially when it comes to developing countries, especially in terms of like scaling up and encouraging big scale projects and exchange of knowledge. But what else can be done in such regional agreements, and in the case of AfCFTA, is to consider clear gender-based provisions that promote a change in the digital access structure in Africa, and this requires a lot of cooperation between various stakeholders, whether the private sector, government, and societies. And during COVID-19, this proved possible. AfCFTA and e-commerce. Now there's a lot of discussion about e-commerce at the multilateral level and inside the WTO. We need to highlight three key issues that represent themselves as subject to consideration by Africa, because they may have implication on AfCFTA space of maneuvering and negotiations and policy space for the continent. The moratorium and digital products. This has been like a very old issue that existed since 1998. How to address it, whether it needs a little bit of being careful, because countries adopting countries that provide free access for digital products without any customs duties. This may have implication on the moratorium later on. becoming as a de facto. Another thing is the free data flow and data localization. This can also have some implication on AfCFTA policy space, and it can, having some data localization aspects proved beneficial in terms of building a data industrial policy for some other countries that we can learn from. And finally, having some SMEs and gender and social inclusion provisions that take into consideration all that we discussed before. Thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to some more discussions around this with the rest of the distinguished panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for the valuable insights. With looking at the clock, I suggest we get right on with the panel discussion, which will start with statements by our other participants. Let me start with Jamie first. Jamie McLeod is a trade policy fellow of the Africa Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis, and he has consulted broadly on trade policy issues, including with the World Bank, the European Commission, and the Danish International Development Agency. And was formerly a trade economist at the Ghanaian Ministry of Trade and Industry. Jamie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much, CUTS International, for organizing the session, and Yasmin for, as usual, a great presentation. Just as a way of expanding on that introduction, let me say that working at UNECA over the last 4.5 years, a large area of my focus has been on the AfCFTA negotiations, providing technical analysis and support there where requested. I think in this intervention, that's really where I'd like to try and draw some perspectives that I hope would be interesting for those of you in the audience. But the first question I was asked to think about in this intervention was to talk about some of the specific challenges related to the digital sector in Africa and what some of the innovative solutions there might look like. So for this, we asked businesses through a survey recently that was carried out in East Africa, particularly tech businesses, what were the main challenges that they cited for the tech sector development. And interestingly, the top one was the low online trust of consumers. And this was something Yasmin also mentioned in her first presentation. The second thing that we came across was the lack of technical and business skills. About 20% said this. Thirdly, availability of finance and credit. And then also, low internet penetration, low internet reliability, and high internet costs, although these weren't the most pressing issues cited. And to kind of categorize some of the innovative solutions in that area from different research, I think one kind of solution you see quite frequently is reliance on more basic technologies. So, for instance, one study in Niger, where only 5% of the population have access to internet, saw a greater use of simple SMS technologies rather than fully fledged kind of online solutions. And another study I was involved in, very much liked from BFA Global, was looking at what can be called social e-commerce or iWorking, in which rather than setting up kind of proprietary apps and sites and digital services, many entrepreneurs were using existing platforms, social media platforms like Facebook or WhatsApp, to engage with customers to circumvent some of these challenges, such as getting access to technical skills, getting over the barrier of trust, and simply using these existing challenges platforms for marketing rather than maybe more of the trust-intensive kind of businesses that might require online payments or logistics or dispute resolution options. So I think that kind of summarizes some of the nice innovations that have been happening given these challenges. But for the second point in this intervention, let me move on to the AfCFTA negotiations and how they can contribute and help. So we asked the same businesses we surveyed, what were the top 5 obstacles they faced when conducting cross-border e-commerce? And they said the main one was just standard good issues trades, things like postal competence, delivery and transport, customs duties and procedures, certifications and standards, things which weren't specific to e-commerce necessarily, but more just to the trading environment, and things that we would very much hope that the AfCFTA, but also Africa's existing trading arrangements can help improve in those areas. They also, secondly, said taxation regulations. I think whenever you ask the private sector what they want, they say less taxes. Thirdly, they said online payment solutions was a challenge. Fourthly, differing national regulations. And here there was both awareness over what those regulations were in different markets, and also difficulty in meeting some of those regulations. Fifthly, they said cross-border dispute resolution. And what I thought was really interesting in our results was there was only a smaller number of these firms that said things like inadequate cybercrime laws or intellectual property right laws or data protection regulations. And there may be different reasons for that, but that was interesting because these are sometimes the areas that we focus on, and perhaps maybe overly so. And we also asked them what regulations would be critical for boosting e-commerce with other African countries. And here they told us harmonized laws for taxation. They said consumer protection regulations for building online trust, again, similar to what Yasmin mentioned. And a lot of harmonization kind of issues. They said harmonized laws on electronic trade, digital signature, harmonized data standards and privacy laws. They also were quite interested in having no local presence requirements. That would be helpful. And interestingly, less mentioned anything around, no data localization requirements, although that could perhaps be because data governance is already quite liberal and it might not be one of the most pressing issues for them. But mostly a lot around harmonization, which I think was quite an interesting bit of feedback from that. We also, the last part of my intervention I wanted to speak to briefly was what links can be established between the WTO and the AfCFTA on e-commerce tracks. And here, I think actually really the main answer is we can learn in a lot of ways what not to do from e-commerce at the WTO. Because really, if we're frank about it, despite tremendous pressure from 2016, 2017 and onwards, we've not really achieved anything there. And for many negotiators, that is a win and a deliberate solution. But really, I think the negotiations, in my view there, have often been dressed up as being maybe in the interest of developing countries or good for SMEs. But a lot of the time when you look at the provisions, there are things that really have large markets and businesses more in mind. And as an example here is something like something that the US was pushing, which would be no source code disclosure. But those rules were very much oriented around, in my view, what US companies were complaining about in China, rather than really anything that might be in the interest of, say, like African tech firms. And so I think really different approaches can be useful in the AfCFTA. So to conclude, let me just share three suggestions for what I think would be a nice approach to e-commerce protocol in the AfCFTA. And that is firstly, mimicking the language that Yasmin used, but more of a bottom-up approach. I think there's a lot to be learned from speaking to the African tech SMEs on what are the exact challenges they face in scaling up and expanding and operating across borders. And negotiations should perhaps be more oriented around them rather than maybe what has just been the discussions in the corridors of the WTO. I think, secondly, it'd be great to focus on some of the low-hanging fruits. I think, as you've already seen, one of the most common issues addressed in trade agreements and e-commerce is cooperation kind of frameworks. And here, I think particularly in the African context, these could be useful for sharing experiences on the enforcement of things like data governance, cybersecurity, and data privacy. And lastly, regulatory harmonization. From our really quite preliminary dipstick kind of assessment, this seems to be what a lot of businesses are saying. It's a real headache for them to expand across African markets because of the different regulatory requirements. And e-commerce protocol could help promote interoperability, maybe through common regulatory standards similar to the EU digital single market. And depending on the level of ambition the negotiators wanted to take, that could involve, maybe common principles for regulations or minimum standards, or at the most ambitious level, actual unified and harmonized laws. But throughout all of that, I think the main lesson for me is to really kind of engage with the private sector and find out from them what would really help them expand across borders now. So thank you very much for the chance to share those initial remarks, and I look forward to James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. We have one more speaker before we go to the panel discussion. Jane Nalunga is an expert on trade, tax, and investment-related issues. She has more than 20 years of experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy, and has authored several policy-oriented studies and articles. Jane sits on several national policy bodies and advises government and parliament on trade, tax, and investment-related matters. She holds a master's in African history from the University of London, and is currently the country director of CEATINI, the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute in Uganda. Jane, you have the floor. Jane, you still seem to be on mute. Yeah, there you are.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Robert. And thank you so much, Katz and GIZ, for organizing this session. And also thank you so much to Jamie and to Yasmin for their presentations, because I'm just going to add on to what they have said. Africa, the Africa continent, is facing so many challenges when it comes to integration in the digital age. The challenges which the previous speakers have talked about are internal, they are also external, they are at national level, they are at regional level, they are also at continental level and global level. According to the UNCTAD E-Trade Readiness Assessment Report, which was carried out in about 7 countries, a number of issues were highlighted, and these issues almost cut across in a number of African countries. The major challenges which the UNCTAD study brought out was, for example, the lack of a unifying vision on the e-commerce, and the fact that most countries didn't have e-commerce included in their national development plans. Another issue was the lack of coherence among the ministries and institutions working on e-commerce, but also the limited engagement between government and the private sector when it comes to addressing issues of e-commerce. And most of the African countries don't have a national e-commerce, strategy. So in addition to all that, there is the issue of the weak regulatory and institutional frameworks, as has been pointed out, and also the fact that there is a poor digital infrastructure. In fact, when you look at presently in Africa, the 3 A's of internet, accessibility, affordability, availability, they are all very poor in Africa. In fact, internet users in Africa are around 11.5%. So you find in Africa almost 80% of all e-commerce transactions are in just 3 countries: Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. So when you look at that scenario in Africa, it will be very, very difficult unless those issues are addressed for African countries to benefit from e-commerce. And I agree to what Yasmin pointed out, that e-commerce is a double-edged knife. So if proper rules are not put in place, then they will exacerbate those conditions in Africa. So it's very, very important that the rules which are put in place and what CFTAs and the Continental CFTA is negotiating, the protocol should be able to address those challenges. In fact, for the CFTA, in a way, it's a plus that the CFTA is being negotiated at a time when there is no multilateral agreement on e-commerce, because this is going to give Africa space to be a policy space to be able to put in place a very strong protocol that can be able to address those challenges which are on the ground. In fact, the rules which should be the protocol, the CFTA protocol, should be able to address the challenges of the digital divide, the infrastructure, the laws, and the institutional frameworks, which are very weak in Africa. Like we have pointed out, African countries are scheduled to start the negotiations of the protocol at the end of this year. So it's important to ensure that that protocol also brings in line, the protocol is in line with the protocols, the future protocols which will be negotiated in investment, competition policy, intellectual property, which are supposed to be negotiated in the second phase of the CFTA. So the fact that there is no binding agreement on e-commerce at the multilateral level should be a plus, and our negotiators should be able to take advantage of that policy space and use it optimally. In order to be able to come up with a good protocol, it's important to redefine, because already there is a policy space. The protocol can be able to redefine such e-commerce key parameters, for example, the issue of definition. What kind of definition do we want? The definition of e-commerce as African countries. What should be the scope? What should be the objectives? So the e-commerce, that policy space, is important for us to be able to go beyond and be able to question and redefine those parameters. The e-commerce protocol can also be used to consolidate Africa's position at the multilateral level. Today, the African position, there is no united front when it comes to African negotiators in the e-commerce negotiations at the multilateral level. So coming up with this protocol will help in defining a common position for Africa. But all this will require inclusive negotiations, inclusive debate. And I agree with Jamie and Yasmin about the whole issue of the bottom-up space. Africa, we need a lot of technical assistance to be able to do this. But what's very, very important is that the protocol should be owned, and then Africa should also be given policy space to be able to come up with a policy, with a protocol that is appropriate for the challenges on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Superbly within the time as well. Perfect. Thank you very much for your input. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Tammo, who I know has to leave us right now. So thank you very much, Tammo, for your input in the beginning, and thank you for being here. And we have another 10 minutes left for the panel discussion among the panelists before we open up also to the floor. I've seen many questions come by already. So I would like to use these 10 minutes to give the panelists the opportunity to respond also to one another insofar they haven't done so yet. And Yasmin, maybe you would like to start out.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Jane, for these very insightful inputs that actually completed a lot of what I was able to share today. I have a question for Jamie with regard to the study. He shared some insights from in his intervention. I wanted to know whether the interviewed private sector representatives, were they mainly leading digital businesses like e-commerce related businesses, or was it more of like business and the small and medium enterprises in general? Another question, I was also very surprised by the taxes policy coming as one of the key policies that they would like to see harmonized. Not very surprised, at least taxes regulations have been always a sort of the easier they read those, the easier they are able to comprehend those, the easier they can decide about their businesses. So I'm not surprised, but I also wanted to see if you can put this a bit in the context of the current discussions about digital taxes in the OECD and the EU, and are those businesses aware that there are discussions about this, and how they may be able to perceive it in their context and for Africa in general. So this is another policy area that is interesting to see for Africa, closely related to promoting e-commerce, and that is being discussed on the multilateral level as well. And a question for Jane, if we have the time, about gender mainstreaming, and I wanted to learn a bit from her, from her perspective, which is better in the case of Africa? I mean, which worked better to have policies at the national level scaled up, or to have policies at the regional economic communities that are being scaled down at the national level and promoted? Thank you.
Jamie, would you like to respond first?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Yasmin, for the questions. So firstly, on this study, about 70% of the firms that we spoke to were involved in the e-commerce kind of area, to varying degrees. So some of them would have a large, be entirely online, some of them would just have online kind of functions to their business for sales. Whilst we'd maybe categorize about 70% of them as oriented in that area, about 30% were more oriented in traditional kind of economic areas, but had some e-commerce kind of functions. So that kind of gives a spread of the research. And I should mention as well that this research was not done just by us, it was done in partnership with Overseas Development Institute and their excellent researcher, Karishma Banga, on that. On the taxes, I think this is a really fascinating question, because when you think about the amount of debt that most countries in Africa have now found themselves in as a result of responding to COVID, and being unable to borrow to the same extent that countries elsewhere in the world have been, and at higher rates as well. There's really an issue for mobilizing taxation, I think will be in the next few years. And there seems, to me, there's a bit of a justification to maybe allow taxes on the tech sector in a way they haven't been done in the past. If you look at how stock markets have emerged over this year, you can see tremendous gains in the tech sector, and yet many of them are still in many ways able to move to circumvent their taxes around different jurisdictions because it's so intangible, the assets that they use to generate their profits. So I think in those discussions and negotiations, for instance, at OECD on the base erosion and profit shifting, I think a balance will need to be struck on to what extent new kind of tax rules there might just be focused at some of the larger tech companies, and really whether they should go after some of the smaller ones, which I think would be far more difficult. So thanks very much for this question. I hope I've tried to answer them a little bit. I had one question for Jane, and it was expanding on something you mentioned about the almost the digital divide between African countries. You said 3 markets: Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa are obviously the biggest free commerce in Africa. And there's one statistic I came across recently, which was that those 3 markets account for 75% of all venture capital financing going to African countries, and that very small amounts are going to, for instance, francophone countries. And I wonder, with these great kind of divides between African countries, maybe Jane, is there anything you could suggest there for how their interests might be protected or covered in e-commerce negotiations in the AfCFTA? What would they need further support or anything like that? Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Jane, would you like to pick up on one of those questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Robert. I will start with the issue raised by Jasmine on policies at national level and the whole issue around gender mainstreaming. I think, like she pointed out in her presentation, the whole issue of bottom up is very critical because each country faces peculiar challenges. Women, cross-border traders, the youth, the MSMEs, all those groups have different and specific challenges which need to be taken into account. So the whole bottom-up approach is the best way to go. And maybe it would be better also that issues are negotiated at national level, regional level, then also at the continental level. The issue Jamie has raised about the digital divide and the whole issue about the 3 countries dominating, I think it's important to support the smaller countries to be able, one, to put in place national e-commerce strategies, to clarify on what they want to benefit from the e-commerce negotiations, and also the challenges, because the protocol should be able to address the challenges facing the continent, but also facing the smaller countries who are not as yet participating adequately in the e-commerce trade. I just wanted to ask a question also to Jasmine on the issue of Jumia. She said it has increased by 4 times. Is it more of the same people, or is it that the transactions increased? Because if internet penetration in Africa is almost around 11.5%, you find that it's instead of broadening the transactions, it's the same people who are transacting business. And I think this also calls for different interventions in Africa. Thank you.
Jasmine, would you?
Sure. So this issue of 4 times information in Jumia's report, that came in the Q1 report, which means that it reported the period from beginning of the year until end of March. So during those 2 weeks, they were able to at least give indication that for the purchasing online, the transactions online for the last 2 weeks of March increased by 4 times. The same people or not, this is a very liable question, which they answered in the second report. Apparently it was not easy to find the answer in the first quarter. So in the second quarter, what they said is that on-platform penetration increased from 9.9% in 2019 in the second quarter to 23.5% in the second quarter of 2022. So it doubled compared to last year. So this information is more exists more in their quarter two reporting. When it comes to the 4 times increase in terms of sold, this happened in the last 2 weeks of March, and it reflected that most of what the consumers demanded was basic needs like food supplies, and they had to actually increase their agreements with food suppliers and food markets in order to respond to the demand. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thank you very much. I will use this opportunity to briefly intervene, and we will now open the floor also for questions from the audience. And before I give the word to Rashid, who will be taking over for me, I will briefly abuse my final moment here as a moderator to answer one question regarding the BMZ, as Tomo had to leave, unfortunately. There was a question what the German ministry was doing, and it also fits in nicely with what Jane was saying regarding e-trade readiness assessment and country strategies. The German ministry, the BMZ, is actively supporting also UNCTAD's e-trade readiness assessment program and financing many of these assessments throughout Africa also. I think by now there's like 20 of them for the African continent alone. And also supporting countries by setting up e-commerce strategies and figuring out where exactly their weak and strong points are. So knowing where to start actually in the digital transformation process. Just to point that out as well. Rashid, I'll hand over to you for the open discussion part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Yasmin, Jamie, and of course, Jane, for starting this session on a great note, for excellent presentations and your discussion with each other. And let me just say in a lighter vein, because I know all of you and have worked with you, that it seems that in the beginning that you were going a bit soft on each other. And by the time it became interesting, the time was over and Robert intervened. As I said, that was on a lighter note. I'm sure you will be coming in again in the subsequent discussion. Now, in this last about 30 minutes or so, we had set up a guiding question, and this is the time for the participants to share their thoughts and comments. And the guiding question is, what should be the key consideration for African negotiators and other stakeholders for the e-commerce protocol under AfCFTA? I will request our GTW colleagues to, if they can put it on the screen, that question, that would be great, as they had kindly offered. And for that, you can raise your hand, and then you can be given the opportunity to briefly express yourself on that. It will be great to have your perspectives as well. In the meanwhile, I can also see that Mr. or Miss, please forgive me, I cannot, I do not know that. It's Uchenna Ugwu from the University of Ottawa have been asking quite a few questions. One of the questions, Robert, thank you very much, responding to that. So depending on the time, we'll be trying to come to those questions as well. So now I can see that there is, okay, so this is, Uchenna's hand is up, and yeah, let's go to this colleague. Yeah, please unmute that person, our colleague from GTP, and you will have the floor, Uchenna. But please brief and also try to respond to this guiding question as well. We want to hear from you as well, that what should be the key considerations for African negotiators and other stakeholders for the e-commerce protocol under AfCFTA.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. To respond to your question, firstly, I think what is important for the African negotiators is to think about the issues. They're not necessarily trade or economic issues, but infrastructure. Jamie pointed out some of this in some of his research, which corresponds to some of the research we have done at the University of Ottawa, the Open African Innovation Research Group. We've done some research in countries like South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria. The key challenges are not necessarily those of legal provisions or what the law says or what it doesn't say at the international level, but the fact that the infrastructure necessary to carry out e-commerce is not there. So I think that they need to be focusing on the development of such infrastructure rather than the development of laws. Secondly, they need to be aware that harmonization might not necessarily be the key that is needed, in that there still needs to be room for differentiation. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to IP and e-commerce. As pointed out by Jane, the differences between Uganda and Nigeria and South Africa will be there. That need for differentiation has to be kept in place. I find that a lot of the agreements, I've studied the regional agreements that apply both in Africa and in West Africa and in other regions, are being pushed by other developed countries, basically asking the African countries to adopt the framework that they already have in place. My own shock in my research has been, at the PhD level, has been that the regional agreements have even stricter provisions for trade and other things for the African countries than the WTO agreements, which was very surprising to me. But what happens is at the bilateral level, they go into regional free trade agreements, which end up taking away the room for public, in that room that they have. They need to keep that room, that space, I'll say, policy space, because there's a need for differentiation. It remains there. And therefore, I don't think that AfCFTA, as on its own, just by putting in place, saying that, oh, we are going to have this free trade area, it will not be successful, because free trade areas have been tried even on smaller scales by ECOWAS, by the South African group of countries, different regions, but they haven't been effectively used because the infrastructure that is needed is still not in place. Data is still too expensive for the average trader in these countries. That's why it's not going to be used. So even if you establish a free trade area, it's not going to make much change for the countries themselves.
Okay. Thank you, Gina. Thank you for your comments. I will invite the panelists also to respond to that in a minute, but first let me go back to the participants. So this is your time. You heard very patiently the excellent presentations and comments by the two panelists, and now you have heard our colleague Ochena as well. So please feel free to comment on any of that or share your thoughts. The question is that, yes, what should be the key considerations for the African negotiators as they start negotiation and the other relevant stakeholders for the e-commerce protocol under AfCFTA? So any other, and you can use the raise hand functions if you would like to take the floor. Okay, so I don't see any other hands.
There is a hand raised. Uchenna.
Yeah, that is the person who just spoke.
Yes, oh, I thought she'd like to speak again, sorry.
So any other person? Okay, so Ochena raised some very interesting points. Okay, so let me see. Her first point was, and this is my oversimplification, I'm trying to summarize. that the focus should be on infrastructure building, the development of the legal systems or the legal framework, which is normally the case with the agreements. They are about creating standards or legal norms, either in hard core or in soft core fashion. But her argument is that the focus for Africans should be on building the infrastructure. So the intriguing question then becomes that what should AfCFTA do? Secondly, the harmonization that I understood from the presentations to be in the context of the African countries, that the private sector, based on surveys that Jimmy was referring to, showed that the private sector believed that for the trade to occur among African countries, there is a need of harmonization. I would take the harmonization to mean not necessarily having the same rules everywhere. That is never possible. There are different ways of doing that to reduce the amount of uncertainty. But anyway, I'll request one of the panelists to come back to that. That harmonization, Chena's point is that instead of that, because each African country has its own situation, and that means that they need to be differentiated from each other and need their policy spaces. So again, the key question becomes that in that context, what kind of actions, progress can be envisaged under AfCFTA? And finally, of course, she was talking more generally about the RTAS, so let's leave that out for now. I can see in the meanwhile that there is another hand up. So the panelists, you have some interesting questions to ponder upon, and in the meanwhile, I'll go and request that our colleague from GTP give the floor to Susan Isiko. Yeah, Susan, you will have the floor.
Thank you. Am I coming on?
Yeah, yes, you are.
Thank you, Rashid, and thank you all the panelists. I'm Susan Isiko. I live here in Geneva. I'm a researcher from ILAID. I just wanted to stress something that the previous contributors made, and in response to what Jamie said concerning availability of internet, he's right that there are transactions that can be done or conducted on mobile phones as opposed to relying on fixed internet or fully fledged, so to use his words. But I think one thing we might have to ask is what kind of transactions we are really conducting on these mobile phones. Personally, I've interacted with people starting from the village, even in town, they can't afford to have the internet or the data for a long time, or even just for calls. It's not going through. There is internet connectivity, and people can send information about their whereabouts on WhatsApp. And there I agree with Jamie that social media can be a way out. But when we are ordering or when we are transacting big business or big data it's really not on mobile. And I would like to stress this because it's a kind of mentality or thinking we've had. I say we as an international community, even at the negotiation of the SDGs, one of the things that were happening at that time was evaluation of how developing countries have come up. And I was kind of surprised when I was reading the reports of the World Set of Information, that WSIS. Then I was reading the evaluation of the SDGs, and one of the things that was clearly written by respectable international organizations was actually there've been a development in countries like Africa because people are having many mobile phones. We might have to ask actually why many people have many mobile phones, because networks, staying on certain networks is very expensive. And when it comes to e-commerce or e-trade, the transmission of data is much more expensive. Even here, let's get an example. If someone from Switzerland, because that's where I'm living, you just cross to the border, France, and you are going to do transaction on data. If you are not subscribed to it, it's very, very expensive. So now imagine if you have to use this as e-commerce. So my point here is that we need to be cautious. What might work in the West and really is dangerous to think that it works, that transacting on mobiles or in a social networking is equivalent to doing business on the internet. I don't think it's really the same. We might have to distinguish or disaggregate what kind of business, what volumes, what kind of products are we dealing in. And we might also be careful not to just take it for granted that for certain constituencies like the global south, it's enough to have just connectivity. We really need that kind of connectivity that will allow the transaction without extra cost. Let's take a vivid example. Just now we've been in this conversation. Jane is seated in Uganda. She was not having a smooth connectivity as the rest of us. That's already the starting point. Imagine if she had to do trade on that connectivity. It would be more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Any other? Okay. So your point is okay. Many points there. The key points for the purpose of conversation right now is the cost and reliability of connectivity, and particularly in Africa. Of course, you gave the example of Switzerland. Let's leave that out, since we are talking about if this is in the context of the AfCFTA, and how that reliability as well as the cost of that connectivity has an impact on conducting transactions in Africa. Do we have any other requests for the floor from the participants?
Yes, I am just going to unmute one more participant, Nicole. I'm just going to unmute you in a couple of seconds.
Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you guys so much for this spirited conversation. My name is Nicole, and I'm the founder of ShipFair, which is a peer-to-peer shipping platform that is trying to bridge the gap in international parcel shipping for SMEs in the textile and apparel space. And so I wanted to, the question about what the AFC, what the protocol should focus on, I really wanted to bring some attention to parcel shipping. So we're gearing up for a pilot, and all of that has been interrupted and put on pause because of COVID, but it still has not made the problem any less important. So in the companies that I've prospected over the past year, who are in the textile and apparel space, many of them are very involved in e-commerce. And in fact, because they're in the fashion industry, that's almost like a standard, right? Everyone has, particularly if you're in the fashion industry, if you're in apparel, you have an e-commerce website. And for many of these brands, they're either based in or sourced from and contract worked to NGOs that work with artisanal communities and really are focused on sustainability. And so they have a social impact arm, and that's really important to them, but they really struggle with parcel shipping. And just to give an example, one of the brands that I'm working with based in Nigeria, the average cost of some of their t-shirts that they're making sustainably are about 15,000 Naira per shirt, which is about $36, $38. But to ship one of those shirts to to ship one of them as a small parcel to someone who's purchasing them from them, an online shopper that's based in the UK, which by the way, 60% of their buyers are based in the UK, to ship one of those t-shirts costs 14,000 Naira, right? And so for a lot of these smaller brands, again, like micro SMEs, it's critical because they're not able to, they have so many abandoned carts on their e-commerce websites, because when people get to the end and they're purchasing a small volume, they can't justify the purchase versus how much it costs. And so I do believe Jamie talked about shipping and just delivery being one of the most important problems that came up. And so I just love to hear, one, I think that should definitely be a key consideration, but then also any other perspectives that you guys have on that would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. A very good point. And Carl, thank you that you raised your hand, because I saw your comment in the chat function, which I was not sure that all the participants can see. So I was going to request you that if you would like to come into the discussion. So yes, Carl, you have the floor.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Oh shoot, my phone is ringing. Just hold on.
They always go at the wrong time, huh?
So yes, thank you very much for this. I think it's very interesting. Actually, the reason we put up Exportunity, we did it together with the Post Office of Benin, so that farmers could get their goods to market at a reasonable price, because transport and so on is really one of the big problems, major problems. And the post office, by using the post office, actually, we kept the post office going because they were going to go out of business. Simply, they're going to go out of business because UPS, all these big international groups were taking all their main income away from them. So with this sort of thing of being able to get people, farmers, to send within the country, was something that that is really working out to be a game changer for a lot of these people. Because if you take, for example, onions, they were selling onions in Cotonou more expensive than what we were buying the same onions here in Geneva at Migros. And all that because the road transport and all the people that were stopping and had to pay bribes here and there made it impossible. So this is the type of stuff we're trying to do, is to reduce the cost of transport and the number of intermediaries along the way. And it's been quite successful, and Nestle now is interested in this as well, because they want to have direct links with the farmers, not going through a whole bunch of intermediaries as well. So I just wanted to bring that up as an example as we're trying to change things.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for just sharing this very interesting, relevant information. Good. I see that we have a few minutes left, and if there are, of course, other participants who would like to come in and share any insights, they are welcome. Otherwise, I can go back to the panelists to respond to some of the questions raised by Ochena and then Susan. Are there any other hands? I don't see any. So is that okay that I go in reverse order, maybe starting with Jane, then Jamie, and then Yasmin? And given the time that we have, maybe 2 minutes each, I know that's a lot, so you don't have to answer all the questions. And quickly to recap, Ochena issue that infrastructure is more important than let's say legal frameworks. So what should AfCFTA do? Then harmonization among different countries is into the policy space. So what should AfCFTA do? And Susan mentioning the reliability, affordability of the connectivity, the connections in Africa, and that being a big issue and problem for transactions. So Jane, you can take any of them, and then we'll be grateful for your input, and then followed by Jamie and then Yasmin.
Okay, thank you so much, Rashid. I agree entirely, and thank you so much to the people who made all these comments. They were very useful. To my sister Susan, she knows the situation in Africa, in Uganda, and I agree entirely that the whole issue of accessibility, affordability is is still very poor. And some governments, like my government in Uganda, because of lack of appreciation of the need for accessibility of the internet, they are taxing it heavily. My sister Uchenna, concentrating on infrastructure. It is important that we should concentrate on infrastructure, but the legal framework is also very important. You know, the two are not mutually exclusive, and the two are very, very important. Legal frameworks are made at different levels, at national level, at regional level, at the CFTA continental level, even what's going on at the WTO, the e-commerce negotiations, that's part of making or crafting the legal framework. For example, at the moment, Africa, a number of African countries have challenges with the proposals in the e-commerce negotiations. For example, issues around custom duties, issues around presence, source code disclosure, around technology transfer. All these issues are part of a legal framework. So the legal framework, if Africa is to benefit from e-commerce, the policy framework, the regulatory frameworks have to be positive, and the infrastructure has to be there. The two are not mutually exclusive. And thank you so much, Rashid. Thank you so much, Katz and GIZ for organizing this session and for having me to be part of it.
Thank you.
And very grateful for your intervention. So, Jamie?
Thank you. Because I have only 2 minutes, I'll just focus on one of the questions, which was about harmonization raised by Uchenna. A very good, difficult question, saying that harmonization should not reduce opportunities for differential kind of regulations in different areas. And I think it's a very agreeable proposition. I think that depending particularly on the rules and the areas you're looking at, the right approach can be different things. And what I suggest to allow different levels of flexibility. What I suggest in my remarks was, for instance, you could have minimum standards is one way to ensure a little bit of commonality and harmonization. Another can be principles for rules or regulations. And only the most ambitious areas can you do something like unified laws. But even there, in that most ambitious area, there is a bit of a precedent. And one example is, for instance, OAPI, the particularly Francophone regional intellectual property rights body, which across 17 African countries does have harmonized intellectual property laws. So I think there's enough flexibility within these agreements to determine in which areas you might allow more differentiation and in which areas you might allow more harmonization and unification to try and address that issue of the trade-off between harmonization and particular policy space in different areas. But I think that's a good point. Thank you for raising it. And thank you also, Rashid, and everyone else for having me too. A real pleasure as always.
Great to be with you here as well. Now, finally, Yasmin, your 2 minutes.
Thank you, Rashid. So for Uchenna's comment about the importance of infrastructure and the regulatory frameworks to come later. I don't disagree with this in principle, and I remember, Rashid, that you came up with this pyramidal approach when it comes to legal provisions that should be addressed in RTAs when it comes to like digital economy and e-commerce, and we always see at the base of the pyramid infrastructure and the enabling issues that are related to e-commerce. So the infrastructure, connectivity, all of this comes first. This is sure. But I would support a bit Jane's also opinion that regulatory frameworks have to develop at the same pace or in parallel. E-commerce context is very, very, let's say, special. You need to trust something that happens away from your eye. You click on a button and you should be able to trust that the bank will send this money to the right person. You need to trust that the information you provided is not going to be stolen or used for other purposes. A lot of these can be regulated by strong regulations that protects the rights of the consumer, protects the rights of the business, and this is very necessary for the business to grow. So I would be more of like in support of having those two in parallel as key for development of e-commerce in Africa. Cost and reliability of connectivity, the point made by Susan, and the whole issue of like infrastructure and connectivity in Africa, I think we need to reconsider or to innovate when it comes to public-private partnerships in this area. This is very key when it comes to making AfCFTA becoming real. I believe a whole reimagination of public-private partnerships to enable Africa to get access to what it needs to leapfrog is necessary. Thank you, Rashid, and thank you for all the attendees and for the interesting discussions and comments. You're muted, Rashid. Yeah.
Hello, before I give the floor to Robert for the final thanking, let me not a summary, but based on this discussion and the responses by our panelists, and with the big proviso that this is not in any way a complete or in any way suggestive for the AfCFTA to take up. But I'm going back to, reflecting on this guiding question, that what should be the key considerations for African negotiators and other stakeholders for the e-commerce protocol under AfCFTA. If I combine the interventions made during this part of the session and the responses, I would say, one, they should be conscious of having a parallel, some kind of a parallel movement on the regulatory as well as physical and other related infrastructure. As was pointed out by Jane also, that these both are quite important, and as mentioned by Yasmin, they can be parallel. We don't have the luxury to first build the first and then move to the second. So, but they should be conscious of this needs, because often the negotiations go into the regulatory side, but they must keep in mind the physical infrastructure side and also be innovative of how to deal with that. Secondly, harmonization, a very, very key question. On the one hand, the private sector, the businesses often would demand that as a reduction in the cost to business. On the other, as Echena pointed out, the countries are different, their needs are different, and the harmonization is neither desirable in all cases, nor, as Jamie pointed out, possible in many cases. So, so that's why, and this is again a key consideration for the negotiators to see that the frameworks that they are developing does take care of moving all African countries towards a more common but differentiated framework, if I can borrow a term from somewhere else, from the climate change negotiations, and they're adopting various means, where as Jimmy mentioned, where there could be agreement on principles, in some cases, if possible, even perhaps adopting a similar rule. And we do have examples of that, like in the SADC context, the road transport rules and the vignette developed for that. And in other cases, giving some kind of a minimum threshold. And in all of that, trying to create a more predictable environment, both for the consumers and the businesses, so that the commerce, the trade, more generally, as well as e-commerce, can flourish among African countries. The third point, which is linked to this physical and other related infrastructure, yes, the access, affordability of connectivity is a key. And that's, yes, that's where in many African stakeholders, it is very difficult. So that point must be kept in mind in how to address that through policy initiatives, through other, as Jasmine mentioned, public-private partnership initiatives. And in that sense, the protocol does not have to be or should not be just a bland legal instrument. It can be visualized as something more larger. And that's where it is also important that the negotiations are not remain limited to the negotiators only. Clearly, one would need inputs from the private sector of how this can be done. Clearly, it would need inputs from civil society think tanks like Jane of how important these things are and what are the practical difficulties and how these should be addressed. And certainly, this can also benefit from the inputs by researchers like Uchenna, Susan, and others. So that's why I would say I would take that point to mean that the AfCFTA e-commerce protocol process, while of course negotiations have a job to play and they have the primary role to play, but the process should allow for multi-stakeholder engagement from Africa. As someone mentioned, that is a key for the ownership of whatever comes out of that. So with these, I will hand over. Thank you again, all of you. Let me now hand over to Robert for the final words of thanks. And thank you all from my side.
Thank you very much also, Rashid, for bringing that all together. And all that's left to do for me is then to thank, first of all, the panelists, Jasmine, Jane, and Jamie, for their very insightful contributions today. I enjoyed it a lot. And also many thanks to the audience for sticking with us and coming up with very interesting discussion points and opinions on the matter. I thought we had a very lively discussion today. So thank you very much for that. Also, thank you very much to Cuts also for organizing this session and for the great cooperation we've had in this project also over the months. So thank you very much for that. And also, of course, last but not least, the Geneva Trade Platform for making this entire conference possible, and in particular our technical support, Antonio, who has been backstopping everything here for us. So with that, I think we are done. Thank you very much, and if you stick around for the rest of the week, enjoy all the other sessions that are coming up, and we hope to see you here again sometime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.